Emma was rushing to catch the last bus home when she spotted a golden retriever limping through the parking lot, a broken leash trailing behind him. What she didn't know was that rescuing this lost dog would lead her straight into the world of a battle-scarred CEO who'd been searching for something far more precious than she could imagine, and that her simple act of kindness would unlock secrets that would change both their lives forever. The fluorescent lights of Riverside Community College flickered overhead as Emma Martinez gathered her scattered notes. From introduction to business management, her hands trembling slightly as she stuffed them into a worn canvas messenger bag that had seen better days. At 22, Emma possessed the kind of quiet intelligence that often went unnoticed in crowded classrooms, her voice barely rising above a whisper when called upon to answer questions. She had learned early in life that blending into the background was safer than standing out, a survival mechanism honed through years of moving between foster homes where being invisible meant avoiding unwanted attention. Her evening class had run late again, Professor Williams droning on about corporate hierarchies and leadership strategies that felt as foreign to Emma as speaking Mandarin. While her classmates discussed internships at their parents' companies and summer homes in the Hamptons, Emma calculated whether she had enough money left on her bus pass to make it through the week. Her part-time job at Moonbeam Cafe barely covered her community college tuition and the cramped studio apartment she shared with her elderly cat, Whiskers, an orange tabby she'd found abandoned behind a dumpster 3 years ago. The October evening. Air bit through her thin jacket as she hurried across the nearly empty parking lot, her breath forming small clouds in the crisp autumn air. Riverside was one of those in-between towns, not quite rural but far from urban sophistication, where strip malls and chain restaurants dotted the landscape like afterthoughts. Emma had lived here for 6 years now, ever since aging out of the foster care system, drawn by the community college's affordable tuition and the town's promise of anonymity. She was checking her phone for the bus schedule when she heard it. A soft whimpering coming from behind a row of cars. Emma paused, her natural instinct to investigate warring with her ingrained habit of avoiding situations that might draw attention to herself. The whimpering came again, more desperate this time, and her compassionate nature won out. She followed. The sound, her footsteps echoing in the empty lot. There, huddled beside a black sedan, was a golden retriever that looked to be about 2 years old. His normally lustrous coat was matted with mud and what looked like dried blood near his left hind leg. An expensive-looking leather leash hung in tatters from his collar, as if he'd fought desperately to free himself from something or someone. The dog's dark brown eyes locked onto Emma's with an expression that seemed to plead for help, and her heart immediately melted. "Hey there, buddy," Emma whispered, crouching down slowly and extending her hand for the dog to sniff. "What happened?" "Do you?" The retriever approached cautiously, his tail giving a tentative wag, despite his obvious distress. Emma could see now that his leg wasn't seriously injured, just scratched, probably from running through underbrush, but he was clearly exhausted and frightened. His collar was leather and expensive-looking, with a tag that read Zeus in elegant script lettering. No phone number, no address, just the name. Emma glanced around the parking lot, hoping to spot someone searching for their lost pet, but the area was deserted except for a few cars belonging to the night security staff. The last bus of the evening would arrive in 15 minutes, and if she missed it, she'd have to walk the 4 miles home through neighborhoods that weren't particularly safe after dark. But looking into Zeus's trusting eyes, she knew she couldn't. "Just leave him here." "Okay, Zeus," she murmured, gently running her fingers through his fur to check for other injuries. "Looks like you're coming home with me tonight." The dog seemed to understand, pressing closer to her side as if he'd been waiting for someone to care. Emma had always felt a kinship with abandoned animals, perhaps because she understood what it felt like to be lost, and hoping someone would notice, someone would care enough to stop and help. She'd rescued Whiskers under similar circumstances, and despite the financial strain of caring for pets on her limited budget, she'd never regretted it. Emma carefully lifted Zeus, surprised by how heavy he was, and began the long walk home. The dog seemed content to be carried, occasionally licking her cheek in gratitude. As they walked through the quiet streets of Riverside, Emma found herself talking to him in the gentle, reassuring tone she used with all animals. "I know this is scary," she said softly, adjusting her grip as they passed beneath a streetlight. "I was scared too when I first came here. But sometimes getting lost is just the universe's way of helping you find where you really belong." Zeus whined softly in response, as if he understood every word. Emma had always believed that animals were more perceptive than people gave them credit for, capable of sensing emotions and intentions that humans often missed. There was something special about this particular dog, something in his intelligent gaze that suggested he was more than just an ordinary pet. Her studio apartment was on the third floor of a converted Victorian house, reached by a narrow staircase that creaked with every step. Emma paused outside her door, suddenly self-conscious about bringing a clearly expensive dog into her modest living space. The apartment was clean but sparse, a futon that doubled as her bed, a small kitchenette with appliances that belonged in a museum, and a corner desk where she did her homework by the light of a pharmacy lamp. Whiskers emerged from his favorite hiding spot under the desk, his green eyes wary as he assessed the new arrival. Zeus wagged his tail hopefully, but the older cat maintained his distance, settling on the windowsill to observe from a safe vantage point. Emma set Zeus down gently and watched as he explored the small space, sniffing everything with careful attention. She filled a bowl with water, which he lapped up gratefully, and shared some of Whisker's kibble, which Zeus ate politely despite it probably being far below his usual standard of cuisine. As the dog settled onto the small rug beside her futon, Emma pulled out her laptop and began searching online for lost pet postings in the area. She checked Craigslist, Facebook community groups, and the local animal shelter's website, but found no mention of a missing golden retriever named Zeus. She created her own post, describing the dog and asking his owner to contact her, but knew it might be days before anyone saw it. Lying in bed that night with Zeus curled up on the floor beside her and Whiskers claiming his usual spot at her feet, Emma felt a strange sense of completeness she hadn't experienced in years. For someone who had spent most of her life feeling like an outsider, having these small creatures depend on her gave her a purpose she'd never found in her college courses or part-time job. She didn't know that across town, in a glass penthouse. Overlooking the river, someone was pacing the floor in desperate anguish, phone pressed to his ear as he spoke to private investigators and hired security teams. She didn't know that Zeus wasn't just any dog, but a specially trained companion, animal whose disappearance had triggered a search involving dozens of people and thousands of dollars. And she certainly didn't know that the simple act of showing kindness to a lost animal would soon bring her face to face with a man whose wealth was matched only by the depth of his hidden wounds. The next morning dawned grey and drizzling, matching Emma's mood as she prepared for another day of classes and work. Zeus had slept peacefully through the night and seemed perfectly content in his temporary home, following her around the small apartment as she got ready. She'd managed to fashion a makeshift leash from an old belt, and Zeus walked beside her, with the dignity of a dog who was accustomed to much finer accommodations. At Moonbeam Cafe, her supervisor, Mrs. Rodriguez, raised an eyebrow at the dog waiting patiently outside the front door, but didn't comment when Emma explained she was caring for a lost pet. The morning shift was typically slow, giving Emma time to continue her online search for Zeus's owner while she restocked the pastry case and brewed fresh coffee. It was nearly noon when the black limousine pulled up outside the small cafe, so out of place in the modest strip mall that several customers stopped mid-conversation to stare. Emma glanced up from the espresso machine, assuming it was someone lost looking for directions to the country club across town. She certainly never expected the man who stepped out of the vehicle, tall, broad-shouldered, with the kind of commanding presence that seemed to fill any room he entered. He wore a charcoal grey suit that probably cost more than Emma made in 6 months. But what caught her attention wasn't his obvious wealth. It was his eyes, steel blue and haunted, carrying the weight of experiences that had carved lines of premature aging into what was otherwise a remarkably handsome face. There was something about the way he moved, purposeful yet cautious, that reminded Emma of the veterans who sometimes came into the cafe, men and women who carried invisible wounds that never quite healed. The man approached the counter with measured steps, his gaze scanning the cafe as if assessing potential threats. Another habit Emma recognized from the military customers who frequented Moonbeam. When his eyes finally settled on her, she felt a jolt of recognition she couldn't quite place, as if she'd been waiting her entire life to meet this stranger. "Excuse me," he said, his voice deep and carefully controlled. "I'm looking for someone who might have found a golden retriever yesterday evening. My name is David Chen." Emma's heart skipped as the pieces clicked into place. The expensive collar, the intelligent eyes, the way Zeus had carried himself with such dignity despite his distress. This was clearly no ordinary pet owner standing before her. David Chen's presence seemed to charge the air around him, and Emma found herself fighting the familiar urge to shrink back into invisibility. "Zeus," she managed to whisper, her voice barely audible over the cafe's ambient noise. "You're looking for Zeus." David's entire demeanor shifted in an instant. The carefully controlled mask slipped, revealing raw relief mixed with something Emma couldn't quite identify. Vulnerability, perhaps, or a desperate hope he'd been afraid to acknowledge. His shoulders sagged slightly, as if he'd been carrying the weight of the world and had finally found permission to set it down. "You found him," David said, and it wasn't a question. His voice carried the kind of certainty that came from years of reading situations and people with military precision. "Is he safe? Is he hurt?" Emma nodded quickly, suddenly aware that her hands were shaking as she untied her apron. "He's fine, a little scratched up, but nothing serious. He's been perfect, slept through the night, ate well, got along with our cat." She was babbling now, nervous energy making her words tumble over each other. "I posted online looking for his owner, checked everywhere I could think of. I was so worried someone was missing him." The transformation in David's face was remarkable. The haunted look didn't disappear entirely, but it was joined by something warmer, something that made him look years younger, despite the silver threading through his dark hair. Emma guessed he was in his mid-30s, though the lines around his eyes suggested he'd lived through more than most people twice his age. "Thank you," he said simply, but the words carried tremendous weight. "You have no idea what this means to me." Mrs. Rodriguez appeared from the back room, her maternal instincts immediately activated by the obvious emotion in the air. "Emma, Mija, is everything all right?" "This is Zeus's owner," Emma explained, then turned back to David. "I live just a few blocks away. He's at my apartment. I didn't want to leave him alone at work." David nodded, pulling out his phone. "I'll have my driver take us there, if that's acceptable to you." Emma glanced at Mrs. Rodriguez, who made a shooing motion with her dish towel. Go, go. Bring that sweet dog back to his family. I'll cover the rest of your shift." Walking toward the limousine felt surreal, like stepping into someone else's life. The driver, a distinguished man in his 50s wearing a perfectly pressed uniform, opened the door with practiced efficiency. Emma had never been in a vehicle more luxurious than her high school friend's Honda Civic, and she tried not to gawk at the leather seats and polished wood accents. David settled across from her, maintaining a respectful distance, but studying. Her face with an intensity that made Emma's cheeks burn. She focused on her hands, folded carefully in her lap, fighting the urge to fidget under his gaze. "I'm sorry," David said after a moment, seeming to realize he was making her uncomfortable. "I don't mean to stare. It's just Zeus doesn't trust easily. The fact that he went with you, that he was comfortable enough to sleep in your home." He trailed off, shaking his head in apparent amazement. "Animals seem to like me," Emma said, quietly. "I've always felt more comfortable with them than with people, I guess." Something in David's expression shifted, a flicker of recognition that suggested he understood that sentiment all too well. "What's your name?" he asked gently. "Emma Martinez," she replied, then immediately felt foolish for using her full name, as if this were a job interview rather than a simple pet return. "Emma," David repeated, and the way he said it made her name sound more significant than it ever had before. "I'm David Chen, though I suppose you already knew that from Zeus's tag." Emma shook her head. "Actually, the tag just said Zeus. No contact information." David's eyebrows rose in surprise. "No phone number, no address?" When Emma confirmed this, he made a mental note to speak with his security team about their protocols. Zeus's collar should have included emergency contact information, an oversight that could have had devastating consequences. They arrived at Emma's building, and she felt a wave of embarrassment as David took in the peeling paint and broken screen. Adar. Her apartment suddenly seemed even smaller and shabbier in her mind, hardly the kind of place where someone like David Chen would expect to find his obviously expensive dog. "He's probably sleeping," Emma said as they climbed the narrow stairs. "He was pretty exhausted last night, but Zeus was very much awake, positioned by the door, as if he'd somehow sensed their approach." The moment Emma turned the key, the dog launched himself at David with unbridled joy, whimpering and spinning in circles and pressing his entire body against his owner's legs. David dropped to his knees, wrapping his arms around Zeus and burying his face in the dog's fur. Emma watched, transfixed, as this composed, powerful man dissolved into raw emotion. His shoulders shook, and she realized he was crying. Not the neat, controlled tears of someone maintaining their dignity, but the deep, racking sobs of someone who had been holding back a dam of grief and relief. Emma retreated to her kitchenette, busying herself with making tea to give David privacy for his reunion. Whiskers observed the scene from his perch on the windowsill, his tail twitching with what might have been approval. The apartment filled with the sounds of David murmuring to Zeus in what sounded like a mixture of English and what Emma thought might be Mandarin, his voice thick with emotion. When David finally composed himself, he remained on the floor, Zeus pressed against his side, as if afraid to let his owner out of reach again. "I'm sorry," he said, his voice rough. "I don't usually, that is, I'm not typically so." "You don't need to apologize," Emma said softly, bringing him a cup of tea. "He's clearly very important to you." David accepted the mug gratefully, and Emma noticed his hands were shaking slightly. "Zeus is more than just a pet," he said after a moment. "He's my service dog, PTSD." The admission seemed to cost him something, as if he weren't accustomed to sharing personal information with strangers. Emma settled cross-legged on the floor, maintaining some distance but wanting to be at Zeus's level. The dog seemed torn between staying glued to David's side and acknowledging the person who had cared for him in his time of need. What happened to him? How did he get lost? David's jaw tightened, and Emma saw a flash of anger cross his features, not directed at her, but at some memory or situation she couldn't fathom. Car accident yesterday afternoon. Not serious, just a fender bender. But Zeus was spooked by the sound of metal hitting metal. Before I could react, he'd chewed through his leash and bolted. He took a shaky sip of tea, his free hand automatically stroking Zeus's head. I've had team searching since yesterday evening. Private investigators, security personnel, volunteers from the Veterans Center. I was beginning to think... He stopped, unable to voice his worst fears. Emma felt a pang, of sympathy so sharp it was almost physical. She'd seen enough veterans at the cafe to understand how crucial service animals were to their daily functioning, how the bond between handler and dog went far beyond ordinary pet ownership. "He must have been so scared," she murmured. "Zeus has been with me for 3 years," David continued, seeming grateful to have someone who understood. "Since I got out of the Marines. 2 tours in Afghanistan before." He gestured vaguely at his leg, and Emma noticed for the first time the slight stiffness in how he moved, the careful way he positioned himself. "I was medically discharged," David said quietly. "Took some shrapnel in my left leg and developed PTSD from several incidents that I'd rather not detail. Zeus helps me navigate crowds, interrupts nightmares, provides grounding during panic attacks. Without him..." Emma nodded, understanding flooding through her. She'd read about service dogs in her psychology electives, had learned about the life-changing impact they could have on veterans struggling with invisible wounds. "You must have been terrified when he disappeared." "Terrified doesn't begin to cover it," David admitted. "I couldn't sleep, couldn't eat. I kept thinking about him out there. Alone, scared, maybe hurt. Or worse." He shook his head, unable to finish the thought. They sat in comfortable silence for a while, watching Zeus contentedly shift between them, clearly happy to be reunited with David, but also showing affection toward Emma. The dog seemed to understand that she had been his protector during his time of need, and his grateful attention made Emma's heart swell with warmth. "You said you were a Marine," Emma said eventually. "Is that how do you work in security now?" She was curious about his obvious wealth, but didn't want to pry inappropriately. David smiled for the first time since entering her apartment, and the expression transformed his entire face. "I run a technology company now, Chen Dynamics. We develop software for military applications, cybersecurity systems, that sort of thing." He said it casually, as if he weren't describing what Emma suspected was a multi-million-dollar enterprise. "That sounds important," Emma said, impressed despite herself. She'd never met anyone who owned their own company, let alone someone young enough to be her contemporary who commanded the kind of resources David clearly possessed. "It keeps me busy," David replied with characteristic understatement. "But it also means I have the flexibility to work with Zeus's needs and the resources to provide him with the best possible care." He set down his empty mug and looked directly at Emma, his expression serious. "I need to ask you something, and please don't think I'm trying to insult you. Is there anything I can do to thank you properly for taking care of Zeus? Any way I can repay your kindness?" Emma felt heat rise in her cheeks. "You don't need to repay me for anything. I just did what anyone would do." "No," David said firmly. "You did what you would do. Most people would have called animal control or kept walking. You took him home, cared for him, searched for his owner. You gave up your evening and probably spent money you didn't have on food and supplies." The accuracy of his assessment stung a little. Emma had indeed spent her grocery money on dog food and had planned to survive on ramen noodles until her next paycheck. But accepting payment for basic human decency felt wrong to her. "I couldn't. Just leave him there," she said simply. David studied her for a long moment, and Emma had the unsettling feeling that he was seeing far more than she was comfortable revealing. "You're remarkable," he said finally, his voice soft with something that might have been wonder. The compliment hit Emma like a physical blow. No one had ever called her remarkable. In her 22 years, she'd been described as quiet, invisible, forgettable, never remarkable. She didn't know how to respond, so she focused on Zeus instead, scratching behind his ears and earning a contented sigh. "I should probably get back to work," Emma said eventually, though she found herself reluctant to end this strange, intimate interlude. "Mrs. Rodriguez is covering for me, and I don't want to take advantage." David nodded, but he seemed equally reluctant to leave. "Of course. Zeus and I have taken up enough of your time." He paused, clearly wrestling with something. "Emma, would you, that is, I'd like to—" He stopped, frustrated with his own uncertainty. "What is it?" Emma asked gently. "Would you consider having dinner with me sometime?" The words came out in a rush, as if he'd forced himself to speak before he lost his nerve. "To properly thank you, of course. And Zeus clearly adores you. I think he'd enjoy seeing you again." Emma's heart hammered against her ribs. Men like David Chen didn't ask women like her to dinner, even as thank-you gestures. There had to be some misunderstanding, some angle she wasn't seeing. "I don't think—" she began, but David interrupted gently. "Please don't say no immediately. Think about it." He pulled out his phone and handed it to her. "Could you put your number in here? I promise I won't pressure you, but I'd like the option of asking again." Emma hesitated, every instinct telling her this was a mistake, that she was setting herself up for disappointment or worse. But Zeus chose that moment to rest his head on her knee, looking up at her with those intelligent brown eyes, and she found herself entering her contact information before she could second-guess herself. "Thank you," David said, as she handed back his phone, "for everything." They made their way back downstairs, Zeus walking between them like a bridge connecting two very different worlds. The limousine waited outside, looking even more out of place. In the afternoon light, David helped Zeus into the vehicle, then turned back to Emma. "I'll call you," he said, and it felt like a promise rather than a casual goodbye. Emma watched the limousine disappear around the corner, then stood alone on the sidewalk, wondering if the entire morning had been some sort of elaborate dream. Her phone buzzed with a text message from an unknown number. "Thank you again for caring for Zeus. He's lucky to have found you. David." She read the message 3 times before saving his contact information, her hands still shaking slightly from the unreality of the situation. As she walked back toward Moonbeam Cafe, Emma couldn't shake the feeling that her carefully ordered invisible life had just shifted in ways she couldn't yet comprehend. Emma stared at her phone for the 3rd time in 10 minutes, reading David's text message as if the words might have changed since her last viewing. 3 days had passed since Zeus's return, and she'd heard nothing further from his owner despite his promise to call. Part of her felt relieved. The rational part that understood men like David Chen lived in entirely different stratospheres, from community college students who counted quarters for bus fare. But another part, a part she tried desperately to ignore, felt the familiar sting of disappointment that came with being forgotten. She was restocking the sugar dispensers at Moonbeam Cafe when the familiar chime of the front door made her look up. Her breath caught in her throat. David stood in the entrance, but he looked nothing like the composed businessman who had retrieved Zeus 3 days earlier. His usually perfect hair was disheveled, his expensive suit wrinkled as if he'd slept in it, and his face carried the hollow exhaustion of someone who hadn't seen peaceful sleep in days. "Emma," he said, his voice rough with fatigue, "I'm sorry I haven't called. I wanted to, but—" He ran a hand through his hair, a gesture that somehow made him seem more human, more accessible. "Could we talk? Please?" Mrs. Rodriguez materialized from behind the espresso machine with the supernatural timing she'd perfected over 20 years of managing cafe crises. "Emma, take your break. I've got this." Emma untied her apron with trembling fingers, acutely aware of David's intense gaze. Following her every movement, they settled at a corner table away from the lunch crowd, and Emma noticed how David positioned himself with his back to the wall, eyes constantly scanning the room. Habits that spoke of survival instincts honed in far more dangerous places than suburban coffee shops. "Is Zeus okay?" Emma asked, her first concern automatically going to the dog who had spent one night under her care, but had somehow claimed a permanent place in her thoughts. "Zeus is fine," David assured her quickly. "Better than fine, actually. He's been more relaxed since you cared for him. More like his old self." He paused, struggling with words that seemed too important to get wrong. "That's actually what I wanted to talk to you about." Emma waited, her hands wrapped around a mug of chamomile tea that Mrs. Rodriguez had pressed into her palms with a meaningful look. David seemed to be wrestling with something internal, his jaw working as if he were chewing over words before speaking them. "I've been having nightmares again," he said finally, the admission clearly costing him. "Bad ones. The kind Zeus usually interrupts before they get too intense. But for the past 3 nights, he's been different. Calmer somehow. Less hypervigilant." David's blue eyes met Emma's across the small table. "I think it's because of you." Emma frowned, not understanding. "Because of me? I only had him for 1 night." "That's just it," David said, leaning forward slightly. "Zeus is trained to be constantly alert to my emotional state, to potential triggers in our environment. It's exhausting for him being always on. But something about the way you cared for him, the peace he felt in your apartment, I think it reminded him that not every situation requires hypervigilance." The explanation settled over Emma like a warm blanket, making her feel useful in a way her part-time job and community college classes never had. "I'm glad he's doing better," she said softly. "There's more," David continued, his voice dropping to barely above a whisper. "My therapist thinks she believes that Zeus's improvement might be connected to my own emotional state. That maybe I'm calmer because I know there's someone in the world who would care for him the way you did." Emma felt heat bloom in her cheeks. "I just did what needed doing." "Exactly," David said with surprising intensity. "You did what needed doing without expecting anything in return, without even knowing who I was or whether I could repay you. Do you have any idea how rare that is in my world?" Before Emma could respond, her phone buzzed with an incoming call. The display showed Riverside Community College, and Emma's stomach dropped. She'd been waiting for news about her financial aid appeal, the decision that would determine whether she could continue her education or would need to find full-time work to survive. "I'm sorry, I need to take this," she said apologetically, answering with a breathless, "Hello." The conversation was brief and devastating. Emma's face drained of color as the financial aid officer explained that her appeal had been denied, that her enrollment for the spring semester was in jeopardy unless she could come up with $3,000 by the end of the month. "I understand," Emma said quietly into the phone, though she understood nothing except that her carefully constructed path forward had just crumbled. "Thank you for letting me know." She hung up and stared at the phone for a moment, trying to process the implications. No spring semester meant no degree. No degree meant remaining trapped in minimum-wage jobs for the foreseeable future. The life she'd been building, modest as it was, had just become exponentially more precarious. "Bad news?" David asked gently. Emma looked up, having momentarily forgotten she wasn't alone. The concern in his eyes was genuine, and something about his presence made her feel safe enough to be honest instead of deflecting with reassurances. "Financial aid got denied," she said simply. "I can't afford spring semester tuition." David's expression shifted, becoming intensely focused in a way that reminded Emma of Zeus when he was working. "How much do you need?" $3,000, Emma said. then immediately felt the need to clarify. "But I'm not telling you this because I wasn't asking for—" "I know," David said quietly. "You weren't asking. You never ask for anything, do you?" The observation was so accurate it stung. Emma had learned early in life that asking for help usually led to disappointment, that self-reliance was safer than depending on others. "I'll figure something out," she said with forced brightness. "Maybe take a gap year. Save up money working full-time." David was quiet for a long moment, his fingers drumming against the table in what appeared to be rapid calculation. "Emma, I have a proposition for you. Please hear me out before you say no." Emma's pulse quickened with a mixture of hope and wariness. In her experience, propositions from wealthy men rarely ended well for women in her position. "I need help with—" "Zeus," David continued, his voice carefully neutral. "Not training, he's perfectly trained, but companionship, socialization. Someone who can be with him when I'm traveling for business, someone who can provide the kind of calm, nurturing presence that you showed him the other night." Emma studied his face, looking for signs of deception or ulterior motives. "You want me to be a dog-sitter?" "I want you to be Zeus's companion," David corrected. "Part-time initially, working around your class schedule. The position would pay enough to cover your tuition and living expenses, with the understanding that this is a professional arrangement with clear boundaries." The offer was too good to be real, too perfectly suited to her needs to be anything other than charity, disguised as employment. "David, I appreciate the thought, but I can't accept money for spending time with Zeus. That wouldn't be right." "Why not?" David asked, genuine curiosity in his voice. "You'd be providing a legitimate service. Zeus responds to you in ways he doesn't respond to anyone else. My security team can provide protection, my housekeeper can provide care, but neither can provide the emotional connection that you established in one night." Emma shook her head, overwhelmed by the implications of what he was suggesting. "I don't know anything about working with service dogs, about military PTSD, about your world." "You know how to be kind," David said simply. "You know how to care without expecting anything in return. Everything else can be learned." The rational part of Emma's mind catalogued all the reasons this was a terrible idea. She was nobody special, certainly not qualified to work for a successful CEO. She had no experience with wealth, no understanding of the social dynamics that probably governed David's life. She would be out of her depth, setting herself up for humiliation and heartbreak. But another part of her, the part that had felt genuinely useful for the first time in years while caring for Zeus, whispered that maybe this was the universe offering her a chance at something better than she'd dared to imagine. "I need time to think about it," Emma said finally. David nodded, pulling out his wallet and extracting a business card. "That's my direct number," he said, writing something on the back. "This is my personal cell. Call me when you've decided. Even if the answer is no, I'll respect whatever choice you make." Emma took the card, noting the elegant logo and expensive paper stock. "Thank you for the offer. Really, it's incredibly generous." "It's incredibly selfish," David corrected with a slight smile. "Zeus has been happier in the past 3 days than he's been in months. If you can give him that kind of peace on a regular basis, then I'm the one getting the better end of this deal." They parted ways outside the cafe, David heading toward his waiting limousine, while Emma walked to her afternoon psychology class in a daze. The lecture on behavioral conditioning barely registered as she turned his offer over in her mind, examining it from every possible angle. The financial aspect was undeniably appealing. Even part-time work at the salary David was implying would solve her immediate problems and provide security she'd never experienced. But the emotional implications terrified her. She was already more invested in Zeus's well-being than was wise for someone who'd known him for exactly one night. Working closely with both dog and owner would inevitably deepen that connection, making the eventual end of the arrangement exponentially more painful. Because there would be an end. Men like David Chen didn't maintain long-term professional relationships. With women like Emma Martinez, eventually he would meet someone from his own social circle, someone sophisticated and educated and worthy of his attention. Emma would become redundant, disposable, just another employee whose services were no longer required. But as she sat through her evening shift at Moonbeam Cafe, mechanically going through the motions of customer service while her mind churned with possibilities, Emma kept returning to the memory of Zeus's grateful eyes, the way he'd trusted her instinctively, the sense of purpose she'd felt in caring for him. Her phone buzzed with a text from an unknown number. "Hope you're having a good evening. Zeus keeps looking toward the door as if he's expecting you to visit. Len David." The message was accompanied by a photo of Zeus, lying by what appeared to be a floor-to-ceiling window, his head resting on his paws, but his eyes alert and watching. The image made Emma's heart clench with unexpected longing. She typed and deleted several responses before settling on something simple. "Give him a pat from me." David's reply came within minutes. "He wagged his tail when I read him your message. I think that's a yes in dog language." Despite her swirling anxieties, Emma found herself smiling at the exchange. She could picture David solemnly reading her text to Zeus, could imagine the dog's delighted response to hearing her name. The image was both endearing and slightly ridiculous, revealing a side of the intimidating CEO that made him seem almost approachable. Her shift ended at 9, and Emma found herself walking home through the quiet streets of Riverside with David's business card clutched in her hand. The practical arguments for accepting his offer were compelling. Financial security, meaningful work, the opportunity to help both Zeus and David in ways that mattered. But the emotional risks felt enormous, threatening the carefully constructed walls she'd built around her heart over years of disappointment and abandonment. As she climbed the stairs to her apartment, Emma made a decision that surprised her with its clarity. She would call David in the morning and accept his offer, not because she believed it would lead to anything permanent or profound, but because Zeus needed her and she needed to feel needed in return. The arrangement would be temporary, professional, and ultimately heartbreaking. But for however long it lasted, Emma would have the chance to matter to someone, even if that someone had 4 legs and a tail. She fell asleep that night with David's business card on her nightstand and a sense of anticipation she hadn't felt in years, unaware that accepting his offer would set in motion a chain of events that would challenge everything she believed about herself, about worth, and about the unexpected places where love could take root and flourish. Emma stood outside, the imposing glass tower that housed Chen Dynamics, clutching her worn messenger bag and trying to convince herself she belonged there. The building stretched 30 stories into the Seattle sky, its reflective surface catching the late afternoon sun and throwing it back in brilliant shards that made her squint. She'd taken the bus from Riverside that morning, a 2-hour journey that had given her plenty of time to second-guess her decision to accept David's offer. The lobby was a study in modern minimalism, polished marble floors, floating staircases, and abstract art that probably cost more than Emma's annual income. She approached the reception desk with careful steps, acutely aware of how her discount store clothing marked her as an outsider in this temple of corporate success. "I am here to see David Chen," she told the impeccably dressed receptionist, her voice barely above a whisper. The woman's smile was professional but distant as she consulted her computer. "Do you have an appointment, Miss Martinez?" "Emma Martinez." "He's expecting me," Before the receptionist could respond, the elevator doors opened with a soft chime, and Zeus bounded out as if he'd been waiting specifically for this moment. His tail wagged with such enthusiasm that his entire body wiggled, and he made a beeline straight for Emma, completely ignoring the formal protocol of the corporate environment. "Zeus!" Emma laughed, dropping to her knees to receive his enthusiastic greeting. The dog pressed against her, whimpering with joy and covering her face with grateful kisses. Several suited executives paused in their conversations to watch the reunion, but Emma was too focused on Zeus to feel self-conscious. "I see you found each other." David's voice carried warmth and amusement as he emerged from the elevator, looking perfectly at home in his tailored navy suit and silk tie. But Emma noticed the way his shoulders relaxed when he saw Zeus's obvious happiness, the genuine smile that replaced his professional mask. "He remembered me," Emma said unnecessarily, still kneeling on the marble floor with Zeus pressed against her side. "He's been watching the elevator for the past hour," David admitted. "My assistant thought I was losing my mind when I told her to let me know the moment you arrived. Zeus apparently has better instincts about timing than either of us." Emma stood slowly, suddenly aware of the spectacle they were creating in the elegant lobby. "Should we... is there somewhere more private we could go?" David nodded toward the elevator. "My office is on the top floor. Zeus has his own space up there, though I suspect he'll want to stay close to you today." The elevator ride was silent, except for Zeus's contented panting and the soft jazz playing through hidden speakers. Emma watched the floor numbers climb, each digit representing a level of success she'd never imagined reaching, even as a visitor. When the doors opened onto David's executive floor, she was momentarily stunned by the panoramic view of Seattle. Spread out beyond floor-to-ceiling windows, "This is incredible," she breathed, drawn toward the windows despite herself. "The view helps me think," David said simply. "Sometimes when I'm dealing with particularly complex problems, I'll stand here and watch the city move below. It puts things in perspective." His office was spacious but surprisingly personal, with military commendations framed alongside business awards and photographs that showed David in combat gear with fellow Marines alongside more recent images of him with Zeus. A custom-built platform near the windows held Zeus's bed, toys and water bowls, clearly designed to give the dog a comfortable space while still allowing him to monitor David's activities. "This is really his office too," David explained, following Emma's gaze. "Zeus comes to work with me every day. Most of my employees are used to him by now, though some of the board members were initially skeptical about having a dog in corporate meetings." Emma settled into one of the leather chairs facing David's desk, Zeus immediately positioning himself at her feet, as if reclaiming his post as her personal guardian. "How did you convince them?" "Zeus proved his worth pretty quickly," David said with a slight smile. "During my first major presentation after getting him, I had a panic attack midway through. Zeus interrupted it before it could escalate, and I was able to finish the presentation successfully. After that, anyone who questioned his presence had to answer to our shareholders, who were quite interested in maintaining their CEO's functionality." The casual way David discussed his PTSD struck Emma as both brave and heartbreaking. She'd known men and women from the Veterans Center who couldn't even acknowledge their struggles, let alone speak about them so matter-of-factly in professional settings. "What kind of work would I actually be doing?" Emma asked, needing to focus on practical matters before her emotions got too involved. David leaned back in his chair, his expression becoming more businesslike. "Zeus needs regular exercise and mental stimulation beyond what I can provide during business hours. He also benefits from social interaction with people other than me. It prevents him from becoming too fixated on my specific needs." He pulled out a tablet and showed Emma a detailed schedule. "I typically travel 2 or 3 times a month for business, Sometimes Zeus comes with me, but for shorter trips or particularly stressful situations, I think he'd be better served staying here with someone he trusts. Emma studied the schedule, noting the careful balance between structure and flexibility. What about training? I don't know anything about service dog protocols. Zeus is fully trained, David assured her. What he needs from you isn't technical expertise, it's emotional intelligence. The same instincts that told you to care for him when he was lost are exactly what I'm looking for in a companion. They spent the next hour discussing logistics, schedules, responsibilities, compensation that made Emma's eyes widen despite David's matter-of-fact delivery. The salary he offered was more than she'd ever imagined earning, enough to cover not just tuition, but living expenses that would allow her to focus on her studies instead of working multiple jobs. "There's one more thing," David said, as their formal discussion wound down. "I'd like you to spend some time here this week, getting familiar with Zeus's routines and seeing how he interacts with the office environment. If you're comfortable with it, you could start officially next Monday." Emma nodded, then hesitated. "David, can I ask you something? This position, the salary, the responsibilities, it seems like you could hire someone with much better qualifications than me. Someone with experience in animal care or psychology or military issues." David was quiet for a moment, his fingers absently stroking Zeus's head as the dog pressed against his leg. "I've had Zeus for 3 years, he said finally. In that time, he's met hundreds of people, employees, clients, medical professionals, trainers. He's polite with all of them, tolerates their attention when necessary, but he's never responded to anyone the way he responded to you." He looked directly at Emma, his blue eyes intense with sincerity. "Zeus saved my life, Emma. Not dramatically, not in some moment of crisis, but gradually day by giving me a reason to get up in the morning and a way to function in the world. If you can give him even a fraction of the peace and joy he's given me, then you're exactly the right person for this job." The weight of that trust settled over Emma like a warm blanket. She'd spent most of her life feeling invisible, unnecessary, easily replaceable. The idea that she possessed something valuable, some quality that couldn't be learned or bought, was both thrilling and terrifying. "I'd like to try," she said quietly. David's smile was radiant. "Excellent. Should we start with a tour of the building? Zeus can show you his favorite spots." The remainder of the afternoon passed in a blur of introductions and explanations. Emma met David's assistant, Margaret, a woman in her 50s who immediately took Emma under her wing with maternal efficiency. She was introduced to key staff, members who worked closely with David, all of whom greeted Zeus with casual affection that spoke to his established place in the office hierarchy. "He has his own security badge," Margaret explained with obvious pride, showing Emma a photo ID clipped to Zeus's vest. "He's officially listed as Director of Morale and Emotional Support." Emma learned that Zeus had a favorite spot by the windows, in the break room, where employees often stopped to pet him during stressful days. He knew the building's layout better than most humans, could navigate to David's office from any floor, and had an uncanny ability to appear whenever someone was having a particularly difficult moment. "He's like the office therapy dog," explained James, one of the senior programmers. "Last month, when we were dealing with that major system crash, Zeus spent the entire night making rounds between workstations, checking on everyone. It was like he knew we needed extra support." As the workday wound down, Emma found herself in David's office again, watching Zeus systematically check his toys and rearrange his bed to his satisfaction. The evening light streaming through the windows painted everything in warm gold, making the corporate environment feel almost cozy. "How are you feeling about all this?" David asked, settling into the chair beside Emma rather than behind his imposing desk. "Overwhelmed," Emma admitted. "But good overwhelmed, if that makes sense. Everyone here seems so normal. I was expecting corporate stuffiness, but people genuinely care about each other. It's taken time to build that culture, David said. When I started this company, I was determined to create the kind of workplace where people could bring their whole selves, including their struggles. Zeus has been a big part of that. It's hard to maintain pretense around a dog who wears his emotions so honestly. Emma watched Zeus settle onto his bed with a contented sigh, his dark eyes still alert but peaceful. He really does seem at home here. He is, David agreed. But he's been even more relaxed since meeting you. Usually by this time of day, he's showing signs of stress, checking on me more frequently, positioning himself for maximum surveillance of the office. Today, he's been calm, confident that his pack is secure. The casual use of the word pack sent a flutter through Emma's chest. The idea that she might belong to Zeus's pack, might be considered part of David's extended family, was both wonderful and dangerous. She was already getting too attached, already starting to imagine a future that probably didn't exist beyond this professional arrangement. I should probably head home, Emma said, glancing at her watch. The last bus to Riverside leaves in an hour, David frowned. You're taking the bus back, Emma. That's a 4-hour round-trip commute. That's not sustainable for regular work. Emma felt heat rise in her cheeks. I don't have a car. The bus is fine, really. I'm used to it. No, David said firmly. I'm not having you spend half your day traveling. Let me arrange for a driver or... David, I can't afford a driver, Emma interrupted, embarrassed by the reminder of their different financial realities. Company expense, David said immediately. Transportation to and from work is a legitimate business cost, or... He paused, seeming to consider something. There's a small apartment above the veterinary clinic we contract with. It's been empty for months, and the location would cut your commute to 15 minutes. If you were interested in relocating closer to the office, I could arrange for you to stay there. Emma stared at him, overwhelmed by how quickly he was solving problems she'd barely had time to identify. That's incredibly generous, but I already have a lease on my current place, and moving expenses would be covered, David finished gently. Emma, I'm not trying to control your life or make you dependent on me. I'm trying to remove logistical barriers that would make this job harder than it needs to be. You can make whatever living arrangements work best for you, but please don't let transportation or housing costs prevent you from taking care of Zeus. The sincerity in his voice convinced Emma he wasn't trying to manipulate or control her, just genuinely problem-solving with the resources available to him. The casual way he deployed his wealth to smooth over difficulties reminded her that they lived in completely different worlds, but also that he was using his advantages to help rather than exploit. Could I see the apartment? She asked tentatively, just to consider it as an option. David's smile was answer enough. Within 30 minutes, they were in his car. A sleek BMW that Zeus clearly considered his personal transport, driving through Seattle's evening traffic toward a neighborhood Emma had never explored. The veterinary clinic occupied the ground floor of a converted Victorian house with external stairs leading to a small apartment that had clearly been recently renovated. Dr. Martinez, no relation despite the name, uses the space occasionally. When she has overnight patients, David explained as he unlocked the door. But mostly it sits empty. The apartment was small but beautifully appointed, with hardwood floors, updated appliances, and large windows that overlooked a small garden. It was easily twice the size of Emma's current studio, and infinitely more. Charming. This is gorgeous, Emma breathed, running her fingers along the granite countertops in the kitchenette. Zeus loves it here, David said, watching as the dog immediately made himself comfortable on the living room rug. Dr. Martinez has been after me to find someone to occupy the space regularly. She worries about break-ins when it's empty. Emma could see herself living here, could imagine studying at the breakfast nook with Zeus curled at her feet, could picture the kind of life that might be possible with steady income and beautiful surroundings. The fantasy was seductive and terrifying in equal measure. The rent would be minimal, David continued, just enough to cover utilities and maintenance. Dr. Martinez is more interested in having a reliable presence than generating income from the property. Standing in that lovely apartment with Zeus, settled contentedly between them, Emma felt the last of her resistance crumbling. Whatever the eventual cost to her heart, she was going to accept David's offer completely. The job, the apartment, the chance to build something meaningful with both dog and man who had somehow wandered into her carefully guarded life. "When could I move in?" she asked quietly. David's answering smile was brilliant enough to light the entire room. Emma had been working with Zeus for 3 weeks when she discovered the newspaper clipping that changed everything. She'd moved into the apartment above Dr. Martinez's clinic, settling into a routine that felt almost too good to be real. Morning walks with Zeus through the tree-lined neighborhood, afternoons at Chen Dynamics where she'd carved out her own, a small office space adjacent to David's, evenings spent helping Zeus decompress from his service dog duties through play and simple companionship. The work itself had proven both easier and more complex than she'd anticipated. Zeus's basic needs were straightforward: exercise, mental stimulation, consistent routines. But Emma quickly discovered that caring for a service dog meant becoming attuned to subtleties she'd never imagined. She learned to read the signs when David was having a difficult day before Zeus even alerted to them, noticed patterns in the dog's behavior that corresponded to changes in building security, weather patterns, even the emotional tenor of important business meetings. More surprising was how naturally she'd adapted to the corporate environment. Emma had expected to feel permanently out of place among the programmers and executives who populated Chen Dynamics, but she'd found her niche as an interpreter between the human and canine members of the team. Employees began stopping by her. Small office, not just to visit Zeus, but to decompress from work stress, to talk through personal problems, to find the kind of non-judgmental listening ear that Emma had always provided instinctively. "You're becoming our unofficial staff counselor," Margaret had observed with amusement after finding Emma mediating a dispute between 2 programmers who'd been using Zeus as an excuse to avoid direct confrontation. David had been traveling more, frequently as Emma proved her competence with Zeus's care, and she'd been surprised by how much she missed his daily presence. Their professional relationship had evolved into something warmer, not quite friendship, but a comfortable collaboration built on mutual respect and shared concern for Zeus's well-being. David consulted her on decisions affecting the dog, sought her input on office policies that might impact employee morale, even asked her opinion on business matters where her outsider's perspective might prove valuable. It was during one of David's longer business trips, a 4-day conference in San Francisco, that Emma made the discovery that would shatter her newfound sense of belonging. She'd been organizing files in David's office, a task he'd specifically requested to help her understand the broader context of his business obligations, when she opened the wrong drawer and found what appeared to be a collection of personal documents. Most were exactly what she'd expect: insurance papers, medical, records related to his military service, Zeus's training certifications. But buried beneath the official paperwork was a manila folder marked simply research, and Emma's curiosity got the better of her professional discretion. The folder contained printouts of news articles, social media profiles, and what appeared to be a private investigator's report, all focused on one subject: Emma Martinez. Her breath caught as she recognized her own face, staring back at her from surveillance photos taken outside Moonbeam Cafe, outside her old apartment building, even walking across the Riverside Community College campus. With trembling hands, Emma spread the documents across David's desk, trying to make sense of what she was seeing. The private investigator's report was thorough and invasive, detailing her foster care history, her academic records, her employment history, even interviews with former teachers and social workers. Every aspect of her carefully private life had been laid bare and analyzed with clinical precision. The earliest document in the collection was dated 2 days after Zeus's disappearance, meaning David had ordered this investigation before their first meeting at Moonbeam Cafe, before he'd offered her the job, before any of their seemingly organic interactions had taken place. Emma sank into David's chair, Zeus whining softly at her feet as if sensing her distress. The dog pressed against her legs, offering comfort. But Emma could barely process his presence through the roar of humiliation and betrayal echoing in her mind. Everything had been calculated. David's surprised gratitude at Zeus's return, his emotional breakdown in her apartment, his carefully crafted job offer, all of it orchestrated based on detailed intelligence about her background, her vulnerabilities, her desperate financial situation. She'd been played with surgical precision by someone who understood exactly which emotional buttons to push. The private investigator's psychological profile was particularly devastating in its accuracy. Subject demonstrates classic signs of attachment disorder stemming from childhood abandonment, likely to be intensely loyal to anyone, showing genuine care, and unlikely to question motives due to gratitude and low self-esteem. Recommend approach emphasizing subject's value and uniqueness to overcome natural suspicion. Emma read that assessment 3 times, each repetition driving the knife of humiliation deeper. She'd been psychologically profiled like a mark in a con game, her deepest insecurities catalogued and weaponized against her own better judgment. But why? What could David Chen possibly want from a community college student that required such elaborate manipulation? The financial costs alone of the investigation would have exceeded her annual salary. The time and energy invested in creating their relationship seemed grotesquely disproportionate to anything she could offer him. Zeus nudged her hand with his nose, clearly distressed by her emotional state. Emma looked down at the dog, who had become so central to her daily life, wondering how much of even his attachment to her had been manufactured. Had David trained Zeus to respond to her specifically? Were there techniques to make service dogs bond with particular people on command? The paranoid thoughts spiraled faster as Emma examined more documents. There were financial records showing payments to the private investigator, to what appeared to be a public relations firm, even to Dr. Martinez for consultation fees that seemed suspiciously large for occasional veterinary services. Had everyone been paid to play a role in this elaborate deception? Was the entire narrative of Emma's new life simply an expensive fiction designed to achieve some goal she couldn't fathom? Emma's phone buzzed with an incoming call from David, his name appearing on the screen like an accusation. She stared at the device, her finger hovering over the decline button, before answering with a voice that sounded steadier than she felt. "Hi, David." "Emma, thank God. How are you? How's Zeus?" His voice carried the warm concern she'd grown accustomed to, but now it sounded calculated, performed. "We're fine," Emma said carefully. "The conference is going well as these things ever go. Too many meetings, too much networking, not enough sleep." He paused. "I miss you both. Zeus especially. I keep reaching down expecting to feel him beside my chair." The casual intimacy of the comment, which would have warmed Emma's heart just hours earlier, now felt like manipulation. "We miss you too." "Emma, is everything all right? You sound different." Emma closed her eyes, fighting the urge to confront him immediately. If David was capable of the kind of deception suggested by the documents scattered across his desk, then he was certainly capable of spinning whatever explanation would keep her in line until he achieved his mysterious objective. "Just tired," she lied. "Zeus had a restless night and I've been catching up on filing in your office." There was a pause that might have been relief. "Thank you for taking care of that. I know it's tedious work, but it helps me stay organized." "Of course," Emma said, staring at the private investigator's report. "Anything for Zeus?" After ending the call, Emma carefully returned all the documents to their original positions, photographing several key pages with her phone before closing the folder. Whatever game David was playing, she needed to understand the rules before making her next move. The rest of the day passed in a haze of forced normalcy. Emma went through Zeus's routine with mechanical precision, maintaining the facade of the devoted companion while her mind churned with possibilities and scenarios. Zeus seemed to sense something was wrong, staying closer than usual and offering frequent gestures of comfort that only made Emma's situation more heartbreaking. That evening, alone in her apartment with Zeus, sleeping peacefully on his bed, Emma researched everything she could find about David Chen's business interests, looking for connections that might explain his elaborate investment in her loyalty. Chen Dynamics specialized in military applications and cybersecurity, but Emma could find no obvious connection between that work and anything in her background. She studied her own foster care records, searching for some detail that might make her valuable to David's interests. Had one of her foster families been connected to military contracting? Had her biological parents been involved in something significant? The records she could access online were frustratingly incomplete, offering no insights into why she specifically might have attracted David's attention. Emma was still awake at 3 in the morning, staring at the ceiling and trying to reconcile the David she'd come to know with the calculating manipulator suggested by the evidence. The man who held Zeus during panic attacks, who spoke honestly about his struggles with PTSD, who had created a workplace culture of genuine care and respect. Could that person really be capable of such elaborate deception? But the documents didn't lie. Emma had been investigated, analyzed, and targeted with specific psychological tactics designed to overcome her natural wariness. The job offer, the apartment, the entire narrative of her value to Zeus, all of it, had been built on a foundation of lies. The cruelest part was how perfectly the manipulation had worked. Emma had fallen completely into the trap, allowing herself to believe she was genuinely needed, genuinely valued for her unique qualities. She'd started imagining a future that included permanent belonging, steady work that felt meaningful, maybe even a deeper connection with David himself. Now, all of that felt like the fantasy it had apparently always been. Emma was back where she'd started, alone, unwanted, valuable only as a tool to achieve someone else's objectives. Zeus stirred in his sleep, making the soft, whimpering sounds that usually indicated dreams about running. Emma watched him in the moonlight, streaming through her bedroom window, wondering if her attachment to him was real or simply another psychological vulnerability that David had identified and exploited. When her phone buzzed with a good morning text from David the next day, Emma stared at it for a long time before responding with the same cheerful pleasantries she'd been sending for weeks. But everything had changed. She was no longer the grateful recipient of unexpected kindness. She was a mark in a con game, playing a role without understanding the script. Emma decided she would continue the charade until David returned from his business trip, giving herself time to plan her next move carefully. She owed herself that much, to understand what she was walking away from before she disappeared back into the anonymous life she'd briefly been allowed to escape. But as she went through the motions of caring for Zeus, of maintaining her position at Chen Dynamics, of living in the beautiful apartment that had felt like home, Emma couldn't shake the feeling that she was grieving something real despite its foundation of lies. The connections she'd made, the confidence she'd gained, the sense of purpose she'd found, those experiences had been genuine even if the circumstances creating them had been manufactured. Zeus pressed against her leg as they walked through the tree-lined streets that morning, offering the same comfort he'd provided since their first meeting. Whatever David's motives, whatever elaborate scheme she'd been drawn into, Zeus's affection remained constant and uncomplicated. It was the one thing in her new life that Emma still believed was real. Emma spent the next 2 days perfecting her performance, maintaining the facade of contentment while David remained in San Francisco. She walked Zeus through their established routines, answered David's texts with carefully crafted responses that revealed nothing of her discovery, and continued her work at Chen Dynamics as if nothing had fundamentally shifted. But beneath the surface, she was methodically preparing for her departure. The hardest part wasn't planning her exit strategy. It was pretending everything was normal when Zeus looked at her with those trusting brown eyes. The dog had become genuinely attached to her, that much she was certain of, and leaving him would mean abandoning the one relationship in this elaborate deception that felt authentic. But staying would mean accepting a role as David's unwitting pawn, and Emma had endured too much manipulation in her life to willingly submit to more. On Thursday evening, David called while Emma was preparing dinner in her apartment kitchen. Zeus lay sprawled across the floor, completely relaxed in a way that reminded Emma how much genuine peace he'd found in their routine together. "I'll be back tomorrow afternoon," David said, his voice carrying the exhaustion of travel and too many business meetings. "I'm looking forward to seeing you both. This trip felt longer than usual." "We're looking forward to seeing you too," Emma replied, the lie sliding easily off her tongue. She'd become disturbingly good at deception over the past few days. "How's Zeus been? Any issues with his routines?" Emma watched the dog in question, who had lifted his head at the mention of his name and was now watching her with alert attention. "He's been perfect. Maybe a little restless the last couple nights, but nothing concerning. He always gets unsettled when I travel," David said with obvious affection. "Having you there to maintain his stability means everything to me, Emma. I hope you know how grateful I am for what you've brought to our lives." The words hit Emma like physical blows. If David was performing, he was remarkably convincing. The warmth in his voice, the genuine emotion when he spoke about Zeus, either he was a sociopathic manipulator or there were aspects of their situation that the private investigator's report hadn't captured. "I'm grateful too," Emma said quietly, and realized with a start that this wasn't entirely a lie. Whatever David's motives, the past month had given her experiences and confidence she wouldn't trade for anything. After ending the call, Emma sat on her kitchen floor with Zeus pressed against her side, trying to reconcile the competing truths of her situation. The documents in David's office were undeniable evidence of deception, but the daily reality of their interactions felt genuine in ways that seemed impossible to fake consistently. That night, Emma made a decision that surprised her with its clarity. She would confront David directly when he returned, giving him the opportunity to explain before she disappeared from his life forever. She owed herself that much, the chance to understand the truth behind the elaborate fiction she'd been living. But first, she needed to secure her own future. Emma spent Friday morning updating her resume, researching apartment listings in Riverside, and mentally cataloging which of her possessions truly belonged to her versus what David had provided. The beautiful apartment, the comfortable office space, the financial security, all of it would disappear when she revealed her knowledge of his investigation. Zeus seemed to sense her emotional turmoil, staying closer than usual and offering frequent gestures of comfort that made Emma's heart ache. Whatever happened with David, leaving Zeus would be the hardest part of extricating herself from this situation. David texted from the airport at noon. "Landing in 30 minutes. Can't wait to be home with my favorite people." Emma stared at the message, wondering if David thought of her as family or simply as a particularly important employee. The distinction mattered more than she wanted to admit. She was sitting in David's office when he arrived, Zeus having announced his approach with excited whining long before the elevator doors opened. The dog's reunion with David was enthusiastic and genuine, all wiggling bodies and grateful licks that spoke to a bond no amount of manipulation could manufacture. "Emma," David said after Zeus had calmed down, his smile radiant with what appeared to be genuine happiness. "God, it's good to see you." 4 days felt like 4 weeks. Emma studied his face, searching for signs of performance or calculation, but found only the familiar warmth she'd grown accustomed to. Either David was an extraordinary actor, or his feelings toward her were more complicated than the private investigator's report suggested. "How was the conference?" Emma asked, maintaining normal conversation while gathering her courage for what came next. "Productive but exhausting," David replied, settling into his chair with Zeus immediately positioning himself at his feet. "I signed 3 new contracts, which means we'll be expanding the Seattle office and probably hiring another 12 programmers." He launched into details about the business developments, his enthusiasm for the work evident in every word. Emma had learned to recognize when David was genuinely excited about something versus when he was going through professional motions, and his passion for Chen Dynamics growth seemed entirely authentic. "David," Emma said when he paused for breath, "I need to talk to you about something important." Something in her tone must have alerted him to the seriousness of her mood, because his expression immediately became more focused. "Of course. What is it?" Emma pulled out her phone and opened the photos she'd taken of the private investigators. "Report. I found these in your office while you were gone. I was organizing files like you asked, and I opened the wrong drawer." David's face went completely pale as he recognized the documents. He didn't attempt to deny or deflect, which Emma found both surprising and somehow reassuring. Whatever else he might be, David wasn't a coward. "Emma," he said quietly, "I can explain." "I hope so," Emma replied, her voice steadier than she felt, "because right now it looks like everything about our relationship has been built on lies. You investigated me before we ever met. You know things about my background that I've never told anyone, and you've been manipulating me based on psychological profiles created without my knowledge or consent." David was silent for a long moment, his hands resting on Zeus's head as if drawing strength from the contact. When he finally spoke, his voice carried a weight Emma had never heard before. "You're right to be angry," he said. "You're right to and feel betrayed. What I did was inexcusable, and I have no defense except to tell you the truth about why I did it." Emma waited, her heart hammering against her ribs. "After Zeus disappeared," David continued, "I was terrified I'd lost the only thing keeping me functional. When my security team told me someone had posted online about finding him, I ordered background checks on everyone who had responded to my lost dog notices. Standard protocol. I've learned to be careful about who gets close to me or Zeus." He pulled out his own phone, scrolling through what appeared to be a folder of similar documents. "I had reports run on 12 different people who claimed to have information about Zeus. 11 of them were looking for reward money or trying to leverage the situation for some kind of advantage." David turned his phone toward Emma, showing her abbreviated reports on the other individuals. "But your report was different. Everything about your background suggested someone who genuinely cared about animals, who had a history of helping others without expecting anything in return. Someone who might actually care about Zeus for himself, rather than what he represented." Emma stared at the phone, processing this information. So, you decided to manipulate me based on that assessment? I decided to learn more about you, David corrected gently. Emma, you have to understand. Zeus isn't just my service dog. He's the reason I'm alive. After I was discharged from the Marines, I spent 6 months planning my suicide. I had the method, the location, the timing all worked out. Zeus is the only reason I didn't go through with it. The admission hit Emma like a physical blow. She'd known David struggled with PTSD, but she hadn't realized how severe his condition had been. When Zeus disappeared, David continued, I felt like I was back in that dark place. The idea that someone might hurt him, or that he might die alone and scared, it was unbearable. So yes, I investigated you. I needed to know if you were someone who could be trusted with the most important thing in my life. Emma studied David's face, seeing pain she'd never noticed before. And the job offer, the apartment, all of this was just an elaborate way to keep me close to Zeus? David was quiet for so long that Emma thought he might not answer. When he finally spoke, his voice was barely above a whisper. It started that way, he admitted. I saw how Zeus responded to you, how calm and happy he was after spending one night in your care. I knew I needed to find a way to keep you in his life, and offering you a job seemed like the most straightforward approach. But, Emma prompted, sensing there was more. But then I got to know you, David said, meeting her eyes directly. The real you, not the person described in some investigator's report. And I realized that what I'd done wasn't just manipulative, it was stupid. Because the Emma I came to care about was so much more than anything those documents could capture. Emma felt tears threatening but refused to let them fall. How am I supposed to believe anything you tell me now? How do I know this conversation isn't just another manipulation based on what your psychological profiles told you I needed to hear? David nodded as if he'd been expecting this question. You don't have to believe me. You shouldn't believe me, based on how this started. But Emma, I need you to know something. Everything that's happened between us over the past month has been real. My feelings, Zeus's attachment to you, the way you've transformed both our lives, none of that was manufactured or performed. He stood up slowly, Zeus immediately alerting to the change in his demeanor. I know I have no right to ask this, but would you be willing to give me a chance to prove that? To show you that whatever this started as, it's become something genuine? Emma looked at Zeus, who was watching their conversation with obvious anxiety, his head moving between them as if trying to understand why his two favorite humans were distressed. The dog's confusion broke her heart in ways that David's explanations hadn't. I need time to think, Emma said finally. I need to figure out who I am in all this, separate from what you wanted me to be. David nodded, though she could see the fear in his eyes. Take all the time you need. Your job will be here, the apartment will be here, whatever you decide. And if I decide I can't trust you, if I decide to leave, the question hung in the air, between them like a challenge. David's answer would tell Emma everything she needed to know about his true character. Then I'll help you transition back to your old life, David said quietly. I'll provide references, financial support for your education, whatever you need to move forward, and I'll be grateful for the time you gave Zeus when he needed you most. Emma studied his face, searching for signs of manipulation or calculation, but found only resignation and genuine sadness. Either David had become a master of emotional performance, or he was finally showing her the truth beneath all the careful planning and psychological strategizing. I'll give you my answer when I'm ready, Emma said, standing to leave. Emma, David called as she reached the door. For what it's worth, I'm sorry. You deserved honesty from the beginning, and I failed you in the worst possible way. Emma paused, without turning around. The saddest part is that you probably didn't need to lie at all. If you'd just told me the truth about needing help with Zeus, I would have said yes anyway." She left David's office without another word. Zeus is confused, whining following her down the hallway like an accusation. Emma had 3 days of accumulated sick leave, and she intended to use every hour to figure out whether David Chen was the manipulative strategist suggested by the evidence, or the wounded veteran who had simply made terrible choices in trying to protect what mattered most to him. The answer would determine not just her future, but whether she was willing to risk her heart on someone who had already proven capable of breaking it. Emma spent 3 days in a state of suspended animation, moving through her daily routines like a ghost, haunting her own life. She avoided Chen dynamics entirely, using her accumulated sick leave to create distance while she processed the revelations about David's investigation. The apartment above Dr. Martinez's clinic felt different now, less like a home she'd been gifted, and more like a beautiful cage designed to keep her close to Zeus, and, by extension, to David. Zeus had been inconsolable. Since their confrontation, the dog seemed to understand that something fundamental had shifted between his 2 favorite humans, and he spent most of his time lying by the apartment door as if waiting for Emma to take him back to the office, where David was presumably suffering through his own emotional turmoil. Dr. Martinez had stopped by twice, ostensibly to check on Zeus, but clearly concerned about Emma's obvious distress. "That dog has been whining for 3 days straight," the elderly veterinarian observed during her second visit, settling into Emma's kitchen chair with the casual familiarity of someone who considered herself a surrogate grandmother. "And you look like you haven't slept since Monday. Want to tell me what's going on?" Emma had been avoiding this conversation, uncertain how much Dr. Martinez knew about the circumstances that had brought Emma into her building. The woman's name appeared in David's financial records, suggesting she was part of the elaborate arrangement, but her concern seemed genuine enough. "Did David pay you to let me live here?" Emma asked directly, too emotionally exhausted for diplomatic approaches. Dr. Martinez raised an eyebrow. "He pays the rent, if that's what you're asking. The boy was worried about your commute and asked if I had any available space. I told him I'd been looking for a responsible tenant for months." She paused, studying Emma's face with the sharp assessment of someone accustomed to reading both human and animal behavior. "But something tells me that's not really what you want to know." Emma pulled out her phone and showed Dr. Martinez the photographs of David's financial records. "He's been paying you consultation fees that seem pretty substantial for occasional veterinary services." The older woman's expression shifted from concern to something approaching anger. "That boy showed you private financial documents?" "I found them by accident," Emma clarified quickly. "David's been nothing but respectful about privacy. I was organizing files and opened the wrong drawer." Dr. Martinez was quiet for a long moment, her weathered hands folded in her lap. "Emma, I'm going to tell you something that might help you understand David's situation better. But first, I need you to promise me you won't use this information to hurt him." Emma nodded, curious despite herself. "Those consultation fees you saw, they're not payment for veterinary services. They're David's way of funding a program I run for veterans who can't afford proper care for their service animals." Dr. Martinez's voice carried the weight of long experience with human suffering. "He's been quietly paying for medical treatment, training, support, and emergency veterinary care for about 20 veterans in this area. He insists on anonymity because he doesn't want the program to become about his charity rather than their needs." The revelation hit Emma like a physical blow. She'd been so focused on the evidence of manipulation that she hadn't considered alternative explanations for the financial arrangements she'd discovered. "He never mentioned anything about that," Emma said quietly. "Of course he didn't," Dr. Martinez replied with obvious affection. "David doesn't talk about his charitable work, never has. The boy spent his first year back from Afghanistan convinced he was broken beyond repair, and now he spends most of his money trying to help other veterans avoid that same dark place. Emma stared at the photographs on her phone, seeing them in an entirely different context. But the private investigator's report, he really did have me investigated before we ever met. Dr. Martinez nodded gravely. Yes, he did. And that was wrong of him, no question. But Emma, you have to understand what Zeus means to that boy. When David first came to me 3 years ago, he was barely functional. Panic attacks, insomnia, couldn't be in crowds, could barely leave his apartment. Zeus saved his life in the most literal sense possible. The veterinarian stood and moved to the window, looking out at the garden where Zeus often played during his visits to the clinic. When Zeus disappeared, David called me at 2 in the morning, sobbing like a child. He was convinced he'd lost the only thing keeping him tethered to the world. So yes, he investigated you. He investigated everyone who might have had contact with Zeus because he was terrified and desperate and not thinking clearly. Emma joined Dr. Martinez at the window, watching Zeus sniff around the base of a rose bush with methodical attention. How am I supposed to trust him after finding out everything was calculated? Was it? Dr. Martinez asked gently. Everything? Emma thought about the past month. David's genuine laughter when Zeus performed his favorite tricks, the way his eyes lit up when he talked about his business, the careful way he'd introduced her to his employees without making her feel like a charity case. The late evenings when they'd worked side by side in his office, sharing stories about their childhoods, their dreams, their fears. I don't know, Emma admitted. That's the problem. I can't tell what was real and what was performance. Dr. Martinez placed a gentle hand on Emma's shoulder. Can I give you some advice from someone who's been watching David Chen struggle with trust and vulnerability for 3 years? Emma nodded. That boy doesn't know how to perform emotions. Never has. It's one of the things that makes him so good with Zeus. Dogs can sense authenticity in ways humans can't, and Zeus has never been fooled by someone putting on an act. The veterinarian's voice carried absolute certainty. Whatever David felt for you over the past month, whatever connections you built together, those were real. His methods for creating the opportunity might have been questionable, but his responses to you were genuine. Emma spent the rest of that day walking through the neighborhood with Zeus, trying to sort through the competing truths of her situation. The dog seemed to understand they were working through something important, staying close but not demanding attention, offering his presence as comfort without being intrusive. By evening, Emma had reached a decision that surprised her with its clarity. She would give David one final conversation, not to forgive him necessarily, but to understand whether the man she'd come to care about was real or simply an elaborate construction designed to keep her compliant. That night, Emma texted David. For the first time since their confrontation, "Can we talk tomorrow? Just you and me, no office, no Zeus. I need to understand who you really are." His response came within minutes. "Of course, whatever you need. Thank you for giving me the chance." They met at a small diner on the outskirts of Seattle, the kind of anonymous place where neither David's wealth nor Emma's uncertainty would attract attention. David arrived first, looking haggard in a way that suggested he'd slept as poorly as Emma over the past 3 days. He'd chosen a corner booth with clear sightlines to all exits, habits from his military service that Emma had learned to recognize. "Thank you for coming," David said, as Emma slid into the seat across from him. "I wasn't sure you would." Emma studied his face in the harsh fluorescent lighting, noting the dark circles under his eyes, the tension in his shoulders, the careful way he held himself as if bracing for another blow. "I almost didn't. But I needed to hear your side of this without Zeus between us, without the office environment, without any of the context that might influence what you tell me." David nodded, understanding immediately. Ask me anything. I'll answer honestly, even if it makes me look worse than I already do. Why me? Emma asked without preamble. Out of all the people who responded to your lost dog notices, what made you decide I was worth this level of manipulation? David was quiet for a moment, clearly choosing his words carefully. The private investigator's report described someone who had spent her entire life taking care of others without expecting anything in return. Foster siblings, elderly neighbors, stray animals. You had a pattern of putting other people's needs ahead of your own welfare. He met Emma's eyes directly. But more than that, you were the only person who actually cared about Zeus's well-being, rather than treating him as a means to an end. Your online post asking for his owner to contact you was focused entirely on the dog's health and happiness. Everyone else was either asking about rewards or trying to negotiate some kind of transaction. Emma absorbed this information, recognizing the accuracy of David's assessment, even as it stung to have her personality reduced to psychological bullet points. So you decided I would be easy to manipulate, she said. I decided you were someone who might genuinely care about Zeus, David corrected gently. The manipulation part, that was me being a coward. I was so afraid of losing the one thing that kept me functional that I couldn't risk being honest about what I needed. Emma leaned back in the vinyl booth, studying David's expression for signs of calculation or performance. What did you need? Someone who could love Zeus the way he deserves. To be loved, David said immediately. Someone who could provide him with the emotional stability I can't always offer when I'm struggling with my own issues. Someone who could be his advocate when I'm too lost in my own head to recognize what he needs. The honesty of the answer surprised Emma. She'd expected corporate speak or psychological maneuvering, not this raw admission of inadequacy. And now, Emma asked, what do you need now? David was quiet for a long time, his hands wrapped around his coffee mug as if drawing warmth from it. Now I need to know if there's any chance you can forgive me for starting this wrong. Because, Emma, whatever this began as, it's become the most important relationship in my life aside from Zeus. The admission hung between them like a bridge neither was quite ready to cross. Emma felt the familiar flutter of hope in her chest, immediately, followed by the voice of caution that had kept her safe through years of disappointment. How do I know that's not just another manipulation? She asked quietly. How do I know you're not telling me exactly what your psychological profiles said I needed to hear? David reached into his jacket and pulled out a thick manila envelope, sliding it across the table to Emma. These are copies of every document related to my investigation of you, along with the original contracts and receipts. Take them, study them, share them with anyone you want, a lawyer, a therapist, a friend. Let someone objective tell you whether anything about our relationship over the past month could have been scripted based on that information. Emma opened the envelope cautiously, finding exactly what David had described: the complete private investigator's report, financial records, even email correspondence between David and the investigation firm. The level of transparency was both overwhelming and somehow reassuring. I'm also transferring ownership of the apartment to you, David continued, pulling out additional papers. Regardless of what you decide about our relationship, you'll have a stable place to live while you finish your education. No strings attached, no expectations of continued employment or contact. Emma stared at the property transfer documents, recognizing the gesture for what it was. David removing his financial leverage over her, eliminating any reason she might have to stay beyond genuine choice. Why? She asked. Because I want you to stay for the right reasons, David said simply. I want you to choose me and Zeus because you care about us, not because you need the financial security I can provide. Emma looked up from the documents to find David watching her with an expression of profound vulnerability. This wasn't the composed CEO she'd first met, or even the grateful dog owner who had offered her a job. This was someone stripped of pretense, offering her the truth without any guarantee of how she would use it. "I care about you both more than I should," Emma admitted quietly. "That's what makes this so hard. I've spent my whole life being careful about who I trust, and then you came along and made me feel like I might actually matter to someone." "You do matter," David said with fierce certainty. "Not because of what you can do for Zeus, not because you fit some psychological profile, but because you're Emma Martinez and you're remarkable in ways that have nothing to do with your utility to anyone else." Emma felt tears threatening and blinked them back determinedly. "I don't know how to move forward from here. I don't know how to rebuild trust that was broken before it was fully formed." David nodded as if he'd expected this response. "Then let me earn it. Let me prove that the man you've gotten to know over the past month is who I really am, not some performance designed to keep you compliant." "How?" "However you need me to," David replied without hesitation. "Whatever it takes, however long it takes. Emma, I know I messed this up from the beginning, but I also know that what we've built together is worth fighting for." Emma stared at the documents scattered across the diner table, physical evidence of both David's deception and his current transparency. The practical part of her mind catalogued all the reasons why trusting him again would be foolish. But her heart, the part of her that had felt genuinely valued for the first time in her life, whispered that some risks were worth taking. "I need more time," Emma said finally, "but I'm not saying no. I'm saying I need to figure out how to separate what I feel from what I think I should feel." David's smile was radiant with relief and hope. "Take all the time you need. I'll be here when you're ready, whatever you decide." As they left the diner, Emma carried with her both the weight of David's past deceptions and the possibility of a future built on harder-won, but more valuable trust. The road forward remained uncertain, but for the first time in days, it felt like there might actually be a path worth walking. Emma returned to work the following Monday with a carefully maintained emotional distance that everyone at Chen Dynamics seemed to sense immediately. Zeus greeted her with his usual enthusiasm, but even he appeared confused by the subtle shift in dynamics between his two favorite humans. David maintained scrupulous professionalism, treating Emma with the same respectful courtesy he showed all his employees, but she caught him watching her with an expression of barely contained hope whenever he thought she wasn't looking. The apartment transfer document sat on Emma's kitchen counter like a challenge she wasn't ready to face. The gesture was significant, David removing any financial pressure from their relationship, but it also felt overwhelming in its implications. Accepting the apartment meant acknowledging that their connection had become something more than a professional arrangement, even if she wasn't ready to define what that something might be. Emma threw herself into Zeus's care with renewed focus, treating their work relationship as a puzzle to be solved rather than an emotional minefield to be navigated. She documented every aspect of Zeus's routines, his responses to different situations, his methods for supporting David during difficult moments. The clinical approach helped her maintain necessary distance while still providing the dog with the attention he needed. It was during this period of careful observation that Emma began to notice patterns she'd missed before. Zeus's behavior around David wasn't just trained responses. There was an emotional intelligence in his interactions that suggested deep understanding of his handler's psychological state. When David was having a particularly stressful day, Zeus would position himself in ways that provided comfort without being intrusive. When David was focused on work, Zeus would settle into quiet watchfulness that allowed for productivity while maintaining his protective presence. More significantly, Emma realized that Zeus's responses to her had evolved beyond simple fondness. The dog had begun treating her as part of David's support system, alerting her to subtle changes in David's demeanor that might require intervention. During a particularly tense phone call with a difficult client, Zeus had actually left David's side to fetch Emma from her small office, leading her back to witness David's growing agitation before it escalated into a full panic attack. "He's never done that before," Margaret observed after watching Zeus guide Emma to David's office for the third time that week. "Recruited help, I mean. Usually Zeus handles David's episodes entirely on his own." Emma found herself pondering this development as she walked Zeus through the neighborhood that evening. The dog's expanding definition of his protective duties suggested he'd formed genuine attachments beyond his trained responses. Zeus wasn't just tolerating Emma's presence. He was incorporating her into his understanding of what David needed for optimal functioning. That realization led to another. If Zeus could sense authenticity in ways humans couldn't, as Dr. Martinez had suggested, then his attachment to Emma might be evidence that her connection with David was more genuine than the circumstances of its creation would suggest. Emma was still wrestling with these thoughts when David approached her office on Thursday afternoon. His expression carefully neutral, but his body language betraying nervousness that Zeus immediately picked up on. "Emma, could I speak with you privately?" David asked, his voice carrying the formal tone he'd maintained all week. "There's something I need to discuss with you." Emma followed him to his office, Zeus trotting between them with obvious anxiety about the continued tension between his humans. David closed the door behind them and moved to the windows overlooking Seattle, his back to Emma as he gathered his thoughts. "I've been offered a contract that would require extensive travel over the next 6 months," David said without turning around. "Military consulting work that I can't discuss in detail, but it's significant both financially and strategically for the company." Emma waited, unsure where this conversation was heading. "The travel schedule would be impossible with Zeus," David continued. 3-week deployments, restricted locations, security protocols that wouldn't accommodate a service animal. It's exactly the kind of opportunity I would have turned down automatically 6 months ago." He turned to face Emma, his expression unreadable. "But now I'm considering accepting it because Zeus has you. Because I know he would be safe and cared for and emotionally supported in ways that matter to him." Emma felt her breath catch. "You're asking me to take care of Zeus for 6 months?" "I'm asking you to consider it," David clarified. "With full compensation for the additional responsibilities, complete authority over his care decisions, and the understanding that this would be a significant expansion of your current role." Emma studied David's face, searching for the motivations behind this offer, this contract. "Is it something you want to do, or something you think you should do?" David was quiet for a moment, clearly considering how to answer honestly. "It's something I need to do. The work relates to developing better support systems for veterans transitioning back to civilian life. PTSD intervention protocols, service animal integration programs, that sort of thing. My personal experience combined with the company's technological capabilities could make a real difference for people struggling with the same issues I've faced." The explanation resonated with Emma in ways she hadn't expected. She'd seen enough veterans at Moonbeam Cafe to understand the scope of the challenges they faced, and the idea that David might use his success to help others navigate similar struggles felt consistent with the man she'd come to know. "But you're hesitating because of Zeus," Emma said. "I'm hesitating because of both of you," David admitted. "Emma, I know our relationship is complicated right now, and I don't want you to feel pressured into taking on additional responsibilities because of my professional obligations. But I also can't ignore the fact that Zeus is happier and more stable with you in his life than he's ever been." Emma looked down at Zeus, who was watching their conversation with the intense attention he usually reserved for potential threats to David's well-being. The dog clearly sensed the importance of whatever decision was being made. What would it look like practically? Emma asked. 6 months is a long time. David moved to his desk and pulled out a folder that appeared to contain detailed planning. Documents. Zeus would live with you full-time at the apartment. You'd have complete autonomy over his routines, his medical care, his exercise and enrichment activities. I'd check in regularly via video calls when possible, but day-to-day decisions would be entirely yours. He handed Emma the folder, which contained what appeared to be comprehensive care instructions, emergency protocols, and financial authorizations that would give her access to any resources Zeus might need. The compensation would reflect the full-time nature of the responsibility, David continued. Enough to cover your expenses plus significant additional income that you could save for your future plans after graduation. Emma flipped through the documents, impressed despite herself by the thoroughness of David's planning. Every conceivable scenario seemed to have been considered, from routine veterinary care to emergency medical situations to potential behavioral issues. You've put a lot of thought into this, she observed. I've been working on the details for 2 weeks, David admitted. Ever since the contract offer came in, I wanted to have a complete proposal ready in case you were willing to consider it. Emma closed the folder and looked directly at David. Why is this contract so important to you? Important enough to leave Zeus for 6 months? David returned to the windows, his gaze focused on something in the distance that Emma couldn't see. Because for 2 years, after I came home, I felt completely useless. I couldn't function in civilian life, couldn't contribute anything meaningful to society, couldn't see any purpose in continuing to exist. Zeus gave me a reason to stay alive, but this contract could give me a way to actually help other people avoid that same dark place. He turned back to Emma, his expression vulnerable in ways she'd rarely seen. I know it sounds grandiose, but I have the resources and experience to make a real difference for veterans who are struggling. If I don't take opportunities like this, then everything I went through, everything Zeus helped me survive, feels meaningless. The honesty of David's explanation hit Emma like a physical force. This wasn't about career advancement or financial gain. It was about finding purpose in trauma, using survival as a foundation for service to others. How long do I have to decide? Emma asked. The contract starts in 3 weeks, David replied. But Emma, I need you to know that your answer won't affect our relationship going forward, whatever that relationship becomes. If you're not comfortable taking on this level of responsibility, I'll decline the contract and find other ways to contribute to veteran support programs. Emma looked down at Zeus again, noting how the dog had positioned himself equally between her and David, as if trying to maintain connection with both of his humans despite the tension in the air. The sight made her heart ache with affection and something deeper she wasn't ready to name. Can I take the weekend to think about it? Emma asked. Of course, David said immediately. Take whatever time you need. That evening, Emma sat in her apartment with Zeus sprawled across her feet, reading through David's detailed care instructions and trying to imagine 6 months of full-time responsibility for the dog who had become so central to her daily life. The practical aspects seemed manageable. Zeus was well-trained and generally easy to care for, but the emotional implications felt enormous. 6 months alone with Zeus would deepen their bond in ways that might make it impossible to maintain professional distance when David returned. Emma was already more attached to the dog than was wise for someone in her position, and extended caretaking would only intensify that connection. But there was another consideration that Emma found herself returning to repeatedly: David's explanation of the contract's significance to his sense of purpose and healing. If she refused this responsibility, would she be preventing David from pursuing work that could genuinely help other veterans? Could she live with herself if her personal discomfort interfered with opportunities for broader good? Emma was still, pondering these questions when her phone rang with a call from Dr. Martinez. "I heard through the veterinary grapevine that David might be traveling extensively," the older woman said without preamble. "Want to tell me how you're feeling about potentially becoming Zeus's primary caregiver?" Emma wasn't surprised that Dr. Martinez had heard about the situation. David probably wanted to ensure Zeus's medical care would be seamlessly maintained during his absence. "I'm terrified," Emma admitted. 6 months is a long time to be responsible for someone else's most precious relationship. Dr. Martinez chuckled softly. "Emma, you've been Zeus's primary emotional caregiver for weeks now. David might be his handler and legal owner, but that dog looks to you for the kind of nurturing support that keeps him balanced and happy." "But what if something goes wrong? What if Zeus gets sick or hurt, or has behavioral problems I can't handle?" "Then you'll handle them the same way you've been handling everything else, with patience, intelligence, and genuine care," Dr. Martinez replied confidently. "Emma, I've been working with service animals for 15 years. And I've never seen a bond develop as naturally as the one between you and Zeus. You're not taking care of him despite being unqualified. You're taking care of him because you're perfectly qualified in ways that matter most." After ending the call, Emma looked down at Zeus, who was watching her with the intelligent attention that always made her feel like he understood more than seemed possible for a dog. "What do you think, buddy?" Emma asked softly. "Are you ready for 6 months of just you and me?" Zeus's tail wagged tentatively, and he placed his head on Emma's knee with a soft sigh that might have been contentment or resignation. Emma took it as a vote of confidence, though she suspected Zeus would be happy with any arrangement that kept his favorite humans in his life. That night, as Emma fell asleep with Zeus curled up beside her bed, she realized her decision had already been made. Whatever complications might arise from 6 months of caring for Zeus, whatever emotional risks she might be taking by deepening her investment in David's life, some opportunities were too important to refuse. She would tell David yes in the morning, not because she was ready to forgive his earlier deceptions, but because Zeus deserved the best possible care, and David deserved the chance to pursue meaningful work. The rest would have to sort itself out along the way. 6 months later, Emma stood in the arrivals terminal at Seattle-Tacoma International Airport. Zeus pressed against her leg as they watched passengers emerge from the secure area. The dog's entire body vibrated with anticipation. Somehow he knew David was coming home today, though Emma hadn't told him anything beyond their usual morning routine. When David finally appeared, looking tanned and healthier than Emma had ever seen him, Zeus's restraint broke completely. The reunion was everything Emma had imagined during those long months of video calls and text updates. Pure joy, relief, and love that needed no words. But what surprised Emma was her own reaction. Instead of the awkward uncertainty she'd expected, she felt overwhelming happiness at seeing David again, as if a piece of her world had finally clicked back into place. "Emma," David said, after Zeus had calmed down enough to allow human conversation, "you look—" He paused, seeming to search for words. "You look radiant." Emma laughed, suddenly shy. 6 months of full-time dog ownership will do that to you. Zeus kept me busy." "He kept you happy," David observed, his gaze moving between Emma and Zeus with something like wonder. "Both of you, I can see it." The months apart had given Emma time to understand what she'd been too frightened to acknowledge before. Her feelings for David weren't based on gratitude or manipulation, but on genuine recognition of who he was beneath all the complications. His regular calls hadn't been professional check-ins, but conversations between two people who missed each other desperately. "David," Emma said before she could lose her nerve, "I need to tell you something. I need to tell you something too." David said simultaneously. They looked at each other and burst into laughter, the easy, natural laughter that had characterized their best moments together. "You first," Emma said. David took her hands, his expression serious despite his smile. "Emma Martinez, these have been the longest 6 months of my life. Not because the work wasn't meaningful, it was incredible, and we're going to help a lot of veterans, but because every success felt incomplete without you there to share it." Emma's heart hammered as David continued. "I love you. Not because you take care of Zeus, not because you fit some profile, but because you're brave and kind, and you make me want to be the best version of myself." "I love you too," Emma whispered, the words feeling like coming home. Their kiss was interrupted by Zeus pushing between them, clearly unwilling to be excluded from this reunion. Emma laughed through happy tears as the dog insisted on being part of their embrace. Sometimes the most beautiful stories begin with a lost soul, finding someone brave enough to care. Emma had saved Zeus that night in the parking lot, but in the end, they had all saved each other. If this story touched your heart, please hit that subscribe button and let me know in the comments what act of unexpected kindness changed your life. Your story might be featured in our next video about the extraordinary power of ordinary compassion.